AI should be helping us, not us, living at the AI's beck and call.
Hi, I'm Aishwarya.
Hi, I'm Nidhi.
Welcome to the CCG Tech Podcast.
Hi, Jane and Nadia. It's really great to have you guys on board. Can you introduce yourselves to our listeners?
Yeah, sure. Hi everyone. My name is Jane, and I'm a researcher and adjunct faculty at Singapore Management University. Before I continue, I just want to say thanks to you both for having us on the podcast. I think it's a really amazing initiative from the Center for Communication Governance, and very honored to be a guest on the podcast alongside other incredible academics, especially Nadia, who is here with me. I personally work in the space of AI ethics and governance, and I teach a master's course on the impact of AI on society at both SMU and BICO. In terms of my research areas, I have mostly been focusing on Asian perspectives on AI governance. So we run a project at SMU where we look at the governance of AI and how AI ethical principles are to translate in the Asian context. For example, how privacy might look like in Asia as compared to how it might look like in Europe. Other than that, I've done a bit of work on AI in the courts, but more recently, I am working in the space of the future of work and platform economies, which Nadia and I are very excited to share more about today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nadia. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Auckland. I'm very excited to be here, delighted to meet all of you. I met Jane through LinkedIn, but we both have the Singapore connection somehow, and we've been working on the Asian dialogues, Microsoft Asian dialogues together. My research is actually in employment law. I'm looking at the moment at the gig economy, the platform economy, and pretty much a dearth of regulation at the moment here in New Zealand. Just a little bit happening in the taxation area at the moment. Um, yeah, and that's me. I teach employment law and taxation as well.
Great, thank you so much for being with us today. I guess we'll start with a more basic question. When people usually think of AI, I think what usually comes up now for everyone is probably ChatGPT and large language models, and more typically maybe hiring algorithms. I guess specifically because
Mhm.
Amazon also made that maybe more popular with its with sort of what happened with their algorithm. So generally, what does AI on the gig economy mean? Like, so usually, what are we talking about? What are the kind of I guess what is the algorithmic intervention that happens on gig platforms?
Mm, mm. I think I can say like I understand the fascination and the appetite for ChatGPT. Like it's obviously a game changer for a lot of us, including myself. Like we can use ChatGPT to generate first cuts of email drafts. So we can use it to refine our work copies, of course, and then we can use it to make our writing clearer. We can even interact and engage with ChatGPT to stimulate new ideas. And then with hiring algorithms, I think the general consensus here is that technologies like that can make recruitment a lot more faster, a lot more efficient, and cheaper. So at the same time as well, it provokes the public imagination because people will wonder, how a machine is to determine the ideal candidate for a job and why these qualities are selected in particular. And also as humans, right? Like we will no doubt, question how such an algorithm will impact on us if and when we are also looking for a job. So I think it's very interesting that you mentioned these two examples because I think this is exactly what a lot of us have in mind when we think about AI. Either this or killer robots, fortunately or unfortunately. So, if I'm allowed to hazard a guess, and maybe I'm just deviating from your question slightly, but I'll return to your point, I promise. I would like to say that these are the type of AI that actually comes to mind and that we talk a lot more about because of their influence and their ability to impact on our lives, whether in positive or negative ways. And then this brings me to the role of AI on gig platforms and why this is not the type of AI that actually instinctively comes to mind when the public thinks about AI that is operating in society. The AI that is utilized on gig platforms, they tend to be a lot less visible. It does not operate as noticeably or directly as ChatGPT or even like hiring algorithms. So in some ways, I would say that it's actually hidden from the public eye, and I think that is the main distinguishing point to take note of. Nadia and I can expand more about the algorithms used in gig platform work later, but very briefly speaking, the AI that is used in gig work manages items like work allocation for workers, the pay for a task completed, how a worker is to be rated and ranked on a platform, and all of which have like real life consequences on a worker's day to day job, and consequently their earning potential also.
Yes, I just want to pick up on what Jane said about Chat GPT coming to the forefront. Now you even have the AI that generates pictures. You can just key in something, a beautiful sunset over the river, and then you'll get an image of what the AI thinks that is supposed to look like. Actually, AI has been around for quite some time. I'm sure people have heard of chess computer programs, and I think there was one very famous program that beat a human being, the world champion in Go. It's a Chinese checkers game, so it's been around for quite some time. And I think this kind of apocalyptic doomsday AI is probably not common across all cultures, from what I know, and maybe some of your listeners from Japan will be able to tell us better. But I know that Japanese people are a bit less scared of AI, probably because of their belief in animism. But coming back to what we're looking at, the platform economy. So the AI that platforms use is very specific. So AI, it can use a huge amount of data, and I heard an engineer say this, that the more accurate the AI is, the less you're able to understand it. So they have this huge amount of data, and that, as Jane has explained, allows the AI to make decisions, basically act like a boss. So if you're an Uber driver or a Grab driver, or I don't know, sorry, the name of the platform you have in India, Ola, maybe. Um, so they can decide, where the driver is needed, where the passengers are, how much to charge if they're going to make money. So all this is done. What used to be done by a human manager now can be done through a computer program, a very specialized, powerful computer program that can do it on a scale that a human can't, and it can make decisions very quickly. And we don't often understand, and that is quite a problem, especially if you're a gig worker.
Thanks, Nadia. Yes, I think AlphaGo was a very interesting case study. I think when it first came up, and then it was played twice, and it's really interesting to see how it's changed how AI was envisioned and how people started getting into the AI race in the first place. I also want to go back to something that you were talking about, which is now that we turn to gig platforms. So I think it's really great to have an AI person and like a labor person on board so that we can have a more comprehensive conversation on this. So there's a lot of studies that suggest, and we can also sort of just see it in our daily lives, that a lot of work is now being mediated through gig economy platforms. So as like you already mentioned, in India, some of the big ones are Ola, which is used for commute. You have Zomato, which is used for food delivery. Urban Company, which is something that people usually use for like smaller errands or getting certain kinds of services in their homes. How does the gig economy experience differ from traditional employment? This isn't really something that's very clearly demarcated in India yet, or people don't have a lot of information on this. So, how do gig economy workers differ from, say, traditional employment or even contract workers? And what kind of effects do you see this having on the labor market generally?
Hmm.
Um, Maybe I can answer that, because I have been thinking about exactly the thing you've been asking. What's the difference between somebody who has what we would say a traditional job, or somebody who's a contractor? Like gig, usually, well, it used to mean, you get different types of gigs. It started, actually, I think the term comes from the music industry. So you're looking for your next gig, right? I'm going to go and play the guitar at this concert, so I'm looking for my gig. And now it's changed. So people look for gigs, they look for work. But the difference now with the platform economy is the scale. Okay. Um, and also it's the lack of what I think is a lack of human element. Sure, if you're on Ola or Uber, you can try and contact Uber, and you're lucky if they reply. You're not lucky if they don't reply. Um, and you have, I think I just mentioned this. You have basically a computer program making decisions that a human manager would make. And let's say, even if you're a contractor, you're not in a traditional type of employment. If you are unhappy with something that your principal or the person who hired you, if you're unhappy with something that they're doing, you can talk to them directly. Whereas if it's a program, like, I mean, who are you going to talk to, right? It's kind of like you're powerless against the machine, so to speak. But there's also because of the scale, the other big problem is that gig workers are geographically dispersed. If you think Auckland is a pretty big city, even though we've got a small population, Delhi's probably even more bigger. So the problem is they might all be facing similar issues, but it's very hard for them to come together and negotiate as a block with the platform. So some jurisdictions have actually started thinking about giving gig workers the same rights as an employee in terms of being. I think Singapore is doing this, where you can be part of a union and the union will advocate for your rights. So I don't know if that answers the question, but
If you're talking about the gig work, more generally speaking, and how it differs, I would say that workers in the gig economy, like all over the world, they're mostly typically considered independent workers, and therefore they do not fall under the traditional protection and benefits granted under our employment law, so to speak. When it comes to the nature of their work, obviously it's quite flexible. Workers are responsible for themselves. They have to ensure that they have the right tools for their trades, and they have to also manage their own leave days and their own sick days and their working hours as well. But when we think about the impact of the platform on the traditional labor market more generally and broadly speaking, I think what is interesting here to consider is the extent to which platformatization will impact on the expectations of work. Especially in the future as gig work becomes more and more popular. So, like for example, right, if a platform worker is able to charge less and work more unsociable hours, like will traditional employees also be expected to provide the same? Yeah.
It's actually really interesting to hear how, with the emergence of gig platforms, the idea of what a gig is and the gig economy is also sort of steadily evolving, actually.
So I think this points to something that both of you have brought up over the course of our conversation so far, which is the pretty big power difference that exists between gig workers, so essentially all the people on the platform offering services, and the actual platforms themselves. And so, one of the things that we've heard so far always consistently, especially from places like Uber, has been that they aren't traditional employers. And so what we're doing is just providing a network for people to actually find jobs and to connect just like the supply and demand side of things. And so, traditional labor protections and those standards shouldn't apply to us. But it does sound like the kind of role that they're playing, at least increasingly, does seem to be what a more typical traditional workplace kind of like employer would provide. I guess I'm just curious about whether, again, broadly from my perspective, the conversation does seem to have shifted to having some kind of increased protections for workers on platforms. Nadia, for example, you used unions as an example in, like, again, a traditional workplace economy. So I'm curious about if there are models, for example, or versions of these platforms you've seen anywhere, either of you, that do this successfully, that do kind of balance workplace protections with, I guess, what platforms are claiming are their interests. Because essentially, again, the argument so far seems to have been that, if you're asking us to provide more protections and sort of like invest more heavily in this, then it'll tank our business model for whatever reason. So I'm just curious about, like, what you think the role of platforms should be, and sort of if there are examples you've seen so far of, and I know there are lots of issues. I know that we don't have a lot of information about how a lot of these platforms work, etc. But I'm just curious about if there are examples you've seen of places that have done this well.
Mm,
I think platforms wise, I can't speak to if I know any platforms in particular who have done a successful job in ensuring workers' protection. But I think some countries might have a better model. Maybe Nadia, if you.
um, in terms of example, well, I think there's a lot of parts to your question. Is this a traditional employment relationship? Some people would argue yes, but then again, you have to think about what the worker is actually doing. Is this their full time occupation, or is this a hobby? For some people, it's actually a hobby, or is this something they do to top up their other income? So, not everyone is the same. So, that's another challenge. One example is Sweden. So there's something very unique about Sweden, from what I've read, that usually there's is in most jurisdictions there's a big dichotomy between employee and contractor, but in Sweden the gap between an employee and a contractor is very narrow. They have, I wouldn't say exactly the same rights, but it's not such a big gap. So Uber Sweden managed to get, well, the unions in Sweden managed to get Uber to agree to a collective agreement with their drivers. It took a year for them to negotiate this. So, well, this is based on the research I've read. I haven't been to Sweden. And they were able to negotiate things like pay, rest breaks, and Uber Sweden seems fine with it. They haven't said they're going to go bankrupt. They haven't said they're going to exit the market. Um, However, in contrast, in I think it was some countries. I need to get this right. Germany, Spain. Um, the authorities decided we're going to make these drivers employees, and what happened was it didn't really work because what happened was, first of all, the platforms found some sneaky ways around the regulation, or they just said it's not viable, we're leaving. So I think the thing that we can take out of this is some sort of way for the drivers and the platforms to get together and determine what's going to work. I don't think it's acceptable to have people not being able to feed themselves or not having proper breaks, but at the same time, we don't want to destroy these jobs. So I think we need to consider platform workers. They're not. I think we need to just create a new category of worker, and I think some jurisdictions have done that. They've defined platform worker.
Was it in the UK?
You no, Singapore has done that. um, um, Australia has done that. Maybe EU. So, well, I think we need to define what a platform worker is. And then from there, we give them some bargaining rights. And we can then slowly think about how we can create this kind of sort of floor of rights, if you want, to make sure that, they're not starving, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, no, sorry, I do realize that was kind of like a massive question for you to answer. One thing I guess I hadn't considered in practice. So when I think of, like, I guess gig workers, I think of more full time jobs because that's usually how they operate in India. So I talk to Ola, Uber kind of drivers and folks who come up on urban company, things like that. And essentially, all the conversations are about how hard it is for them to hit the minimum hours and and essentially ensure consistency. And I guess you've reminded me right now that that's not how everyone operates on platforms, and this could be a very situational thing. So it's interesting to I guess think about the differences that cultural context can have, because a place like India, at least personally, I see this as being more of a full-time thing that someone is doing rather than, something like places in the US or something where people do like a couple of hours over a weekend and sort of supplement their income. I also think it's really interesting to see the kind of differences, because like you're saying, I think they do, like, gig work does differ from traditional employment in some contexts. It isn't like a thing that you show up like on a 9 to 5 kind of context for, although again I think it kind of depends on what platforms you're talking about, what geographical and cultural context they exist in. So definitely something to think about.
Yeah, also, I think it's very interesting to see how gig work is sort of, and the definitions of who gig workers are and what their rights are evolving all over the world. But also, to tie back to our earlier part of the conversation, we can see that the platforms are also evolving at this point. So,
Mm.
to draw back to your example of Sweden, it's great that the managers and then the workers were able to come to a settlement. But, like you mentioned before, people are just removing the human element of the platform now. So, you, I think, brought up a very interesting concept of an algorithmic boss. Can you tell us a little bit more about what an algorithmic boss is and what this next evolution in like a gig economy platform means?
Yeah, I can share a little bit more about the algorithmic boss. It's actually a term that was made popular or coined by this academic in the UK. His name is Jeremias Adams Pressel. So it basically describes your boss as an algorithm. Again, algorithms are basically a set of rules or instructions designed to perform a specific task. So the algorithmic boss, right, essentially refers to the use of algorithms and like automated systems to manage and control workers in the workplace. So I like to think of the algorithmic boss as like an octopus with many arms. So one arm can actually be surveilling and monitoring the workers closely. The other arm may be tracking a worker's location. Another arm might be looking at a worker's performance and their quality of work. Other arms may be looking at how to allocate work to workers or determining how much they should get paid, or even depriving workers of work altogether if they fail to meet certain expectations. So typically and traditionally, these functions used to be carried out by a human manager. We used to have like humans doing all these tasks, and these people usually have like oversight and they possess like certain knowledge and skills. But when we talk about the algorithmic boss, we are now referring to the use of data and AI systems in the workplace to replace this so-called human manager. And they're able and this algorithmic boss is able to perform these functions at a much bigger scale, as Nadia has mentioned earlier, and speed as well.
Um, so the algorithmic boss, yes, I think the big worry is the lack of human input. I mean, if you think about it, if something goes wrong, if something bad happens to you, your instinct will be, well, I want this fixed. It's not fair, I want justice. But if the algorithm does something wrong to you, like how do you fix it? So I think so far we've seen platforms hide behind the black box, saying we don't really know what's happening, etc., etc. Um, but surprisingly, I don't know whether it's surprising or not, but I find it surprising. The EU Parliament has just come up with a new set of rules around gig workers, and they are asking the platforms to be more open and transparent about the data they have, the data they hold, and how they make decisions. I don't know how they're going to do that, but that's the directive. And this is very similar to what we have in employment law, at least in New Zealand. If your employer makes a decision that affects your employment, any decision, they have to come and talk to you and explain whether you agree or not. Like, okay, Nadia, you have to teach an extra class. I might not be happy about it, but I need to be told that this is happening. Well, I don't know where this is going to go in the EU, to be honest, but for me, it's just a big question mark about how we're going to regulate the algorithmic boss.
Yeah, I think we can very safely say that this isn't really the kind of positive development that we were all hoping for would happen with our bosses in the workplace.
So I think transparency has come up a couple of times, and that's something we definitely will explore a little bit. The black box effect and essentially the kind of impact that's having on on the gig economy and also on regulations, I think, around it. But first, maybe we can talk about the kind of issues that workers face on these platforms a little more in detail. So, Nadia, for example, you mentioned that if there are any kind of like grievances that workers have against platforms, that in in an employment context, you would talk to a manager. Now, a manager might or might not be helpful, but at least there are systems in place to make sure that they do something. Whereas, again, in conversations again with like Uber, Ola kind of drivers, it turns out that prices randomly change, the amount of commission they charge randomly changes. They don't understand how surge pricing, etc., works, and it's at least in the conversations that I've had, it becomes really difficult for them to then kind of assess how much they end up making and the kind of hours they'll need to work to hit a certain like sort of internal target they've set for themselves. So maybe the both of you could talk a little bit about the other kinds of issues that could come up, maybe also around like safety, because I don't know how that works for platform for gig workers either.
Well, there's a few issues. So you've mentioned grievances already, lack of stable income. So you've mentioned these two. There's also the issue of discrimination. It's very hard to monitor because a lot of your work depends on your ratings. Somebody comes, it could be sorry, any platform, could be driving, it could be platform where there's platforms for teaching, there's platforms in New Zealand for care work, there's all sorts of platforms. It could just be somebody doesn't like the color of your shirt, or the way your name sounds, or the way you look, and they just decide, well, I'm going to give you a bad rating. And it could be discrimination, it could be something else, but there's again this kind of helplessness. What do we do if bad things happen? In terms of safety, um, in New Zealand we have regulation about the number of breaks that drivers must have, and that applies to all drivers, even Uber drivers, Ola drivers. I'm not sure how well it's enforced in practice, but there's other things as well other than breaks. There's you could have a drunk passenger in your car. If you're a female driver, that might be quite difficult to deal with. If the passenger is male and drunk, not casting aspersions on anyone. Um, but how do you deal with it? If you if you're tough on the person who's being rude or mean to you, you might get a bad rating. Um, so there's a lot of health and safety issues. I think the platforms try and do what they can, but I mean, how far do we have to go? Do we have to put a camera? I mean, in New Zealand, we have very tough health and safety regulations, but so far I haven't seen any prosecutions against any of the platforms. So I think safety, health is a big issue. Um, I think the other problem is also, well, it's related to the lack of income, stable income. So I think, again, I can't comment for other jurisdictions, but in New Zealand, we're very lucky that we have a strong welfare state. So if you get injured or if you get sick, you can go to a public hospital and pretty much everything will be taken care of. So it's not too bad, but in countries where you don't have that strong welfare state, social security, it's probably tough going if you don't have that kind of security behind you. Um, Maybe Jane wants to add on a few things.
Yeah, I think in some countries they have mandated that the drivers themselves take up insurance for it. I can't speak to where, but I will just add on to Nadia's discrimination point earlier. So I think the discrimination in gig work is often like quite insidious, and it's not often direct, so it makes it quite hard to prove. So I'll touch specifically on gender discrimination in gig work. So there's this thing called acceptance rates. So platform drivers, they are sometimes allocated work based on how high their acceptance rates are. So that is like how often they say yes or no to a trip that is allocated to them by a platform. So if you think about it, I think Nadia briefly mentioned it just now. This may sometimes pose problems for women drivers when they are asked to pick up a customer, say at a dodgy street late at night, in a rowdy area where the customer might maybe be intoxicated. So, for safety reasons, the woman driver might choose not to accept that gig. In that case, her acceptance rate on the platform will drop. And over time, if she continuously reject these kind of jobs, she'll be allocated less jobs, which in turn would also have a direct impact on her income and earning potential. So I would say in this case, if the platform does not take into account these type of gendered risks, especially when it comes to like women picking up customers late at night, uh, I think discrimination is happening there.
It sounds like this is a version of the conversation that we usually have with bias in AI. As in, essentially, like this is the kind of outcome. I mean, I know that this is also like external bias of people being, rating people unfairly, for example, but essentially, like the algorithms can potentially exacerbate what is happening in the real world in a biased
For
and
sure.
discriminatory fashion. Also, it sounds like you're saying. And also, it sounds like the only way we'd find out about it is if platforms decide to tell us that this is happening, because otherwise it's going to be very hard for anyone else to sort of
Which
like
would probably
externally
be
come
very
in and
hard.
say things.
I think it's really interesting also that you brought up insurance because in India a little while ago there was a platform that actually started taking away insurance from gig workers depending on how many deliveries it made. So the algorithm decided when you got insurance. There was obviously a lot of sort of pushback against that. I also just want to talk about how you were talking about the algorithmic boss, and I can't get that imagery that you set up, Jane, about an algorithmic boss being an octopus and it just sort of continuously monitoring everything that you are doing, which is, of course, true because that is where they're going.
Mm,
And now that we're talking about how they're sort of looking at every aspect of what you're doing, from what your acceptance rate is, how many deliveries, for example, you're doing, or what your rating is, and all of these things, it becomes really obvious that there's clearly a lot of data that you are aware of and not even aware of that's being collected. So, can we really briefly just sort of touch upon what is the data that the workers, the platform collects? What is it typically used for?
mm.
And what level of transparency do we currently have from platforms about what they're using this data for or how the algorithms are being structured?
Yeah, sure, Nadia, I can answer that. But maybe I will answer backwards and I will touch on your transparency question first. So, from what we have been discussing, I think it's fair to say that there is clearly a lack of transparency in the gig economy. And I think we can say that this lack of transparency operates on at least two levels. First, how the AI operates and what kinds of algorithms are in use is not typically disclosed to the workers themselves. For example, research has today shown that a lot of workers do not actually even know how their pay is being calculated, at least in the ride hailing industry. And they also struggle very much to keep up with the technological experimentation and the changes in a platform's terms of use. So they're not very clear about these changes. And in the ride hailing industry, especially, a lot of workers do not know how their ratings are being calculated. And then this makes it hard for them to be able to fight dismissal decisions as well. On another level, which is more technical, and I think Nadia mentioned earlier, is what is commonly known as the black box problem. So, when a box is black in color, no doubt you will not be able to see what is going on inside. And a lot of the AI that is currently in use by these platforms, they operate in this manner where we have like these type of algorithms that are super equipped to make like really accurate decisions for us, but when it comes to the how and how it arrives at a certain decision, like it is unable to tell us how it's being done. So this will obviously have implications for transparency, especially when decisions are made on the basis of what is decided by the AI, but we are unable to understand the reasons behind it. So some research recently into explainable AI may, to some extent, resolve some of these transparency issues, but ultimately, it is still up to the platform to decide how much information they want to give to their workers. And then back to your first question, like what type of data is being collected from workers and what it is used for. Um, I think it suffices to say that when data is collected, it's always uh, it will always be put to use by the platforms in a variety of ways. So I'll share an interesting example about a researcher who went to work in the tourism tech company, which services travelers by creating very detailed itineraries for them when they visit a new country. So I will paraphrase a little bit, but essentially, these itineraries were initially drafted from scratch by these tourism workers who would meticulously plan a traveler's trip based on their own research and their own experience of what these type of travelers' needs are. And then over time, this knowledge of these workers, right, and the itineraries were fed into an AI system that took the knowledge and experience of these workers to generate its own automated itineraries. So this is what happens when a worker's cognitive property is being captured and extracted into an AI system, which would later make the worker redundant. So you can see that this is problematic because workers are not being compensated and they're essentially shooting themselves in the foot. And I guess for what other purposes, it's not just to develop proprietary algorithms. Data can also be merged into bigger databases, which may give the employer more insight into an employee's life. It may even be sold to third parties, and this would obviously pose privacy issues.
Um, I think we're starting to see lawsuits emerging against, the chat GPTs of the world, how they capture the data from websites, how they take people's data without people actually knowing. So there's obviously the issue of intellectual property, which you mentioned. Like if I create my own itinerary and I lay it out, I have copyright in that.
Mm.
Um, and this AI is using it for something else. And also my personal data, I have the right to know what it's being used for, where it's going, who's going to see it, but now I don't. But I also think that because these challenges are so new, the law hasn't really kept up. We're only starting to see legal challenges emerge now. Um, I don't really know where it's going to take us. It's all a big adventure right now, I think.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting from all of this conversation to note that all of this conversation that we've been having about an algorithmic boss, the algorithmic boss clearly isn't here to be some sort of a fair, impartial friend to you, because they're essentially taking your data and then they are using it to replace you. So there's also a very real concern around the future of work and what you will really have humans doing in the future, uh, which is something to consider as well.
Yeah, I think the idea of the planned sort of obsolescence of workers that platforms seem to be engaging in is like really disheartening to actually think about. I don't think, I mean, obviously that is a conversation that's come up, but I think it usually comes up in the context more on social media and things about like art, for example, Midjourney, Nadia, like you were saying, which allows you to generate images. And so there's been a huge question about copyright and essentially like what the role of artists versus art has been, but also I guess in more of these, because again, like the traditional kind of conception is that there are going to be certain kinds of jobs that only humans can do, and that machines and AI can't. And it seems like since we're using data from humans to kind of train algorithms, it sounds like maybe the scope of that kind of work is shrinking. So I think the question is about essentially what kind of work we want to allow AI to do, and what kind I think we should keep for ourselves. Um, so one thing that's come up for me in this conversation, and typically this is a kind of maybe boring question, but I think one that's also really important, is the role of regulation in all of this. Because again, so even if we talk about transparency, for example, we have transparency mandates now under the DSA. Other countries are also thinking of what getting information from platforms could look like in different contexts. Now in my work I typically look at this from the perspective of social media platforms, but it sounds like and because they do apply to intermediaries, it sounds like that could be a good source of information as well, for getting information from gig platforms, for example. But again, the other thing is, it sounds like unless there is like sort of an overall comprehensive, because even today, right, we've spoken about privacy because of all the surveillance that's happening of gig workers. We've spoken about like AI governance kind of conversations, which is on transparency, on explainability, on that side of things. we've spoken about again, like now, like I said, transparency mandate. So it sounds like, I guess I'm just curious about like what a regulatory response to addressing some of this could be, and what a regulation that I guess focuses solely on the gig economy should contain, and if there even should be, you know, like a standalone kind of regulation. Again, I understand this is a really broad question, so you can take whatever part of it sounds interesting and maybe just go with that.
I think maybe I can attempt an answer. I think it is important for whatever law to come out to focus on ensuring that basic AI ethical principles are being met. So, like you said, transparency. We have to ensure explainability. We want to also make sure that there's accountability. There's grievance mechanisms where employees do not have their rights respected. Yeah.
I think there has to be some sort of framework. Otherwise, we'll just end up with a wild west. I think it's up to us, really, as a species, really, to decide what we want this AI to do. Aishwarya, I think you brought up, you said something very interesting. What do we want to allow AI to do, and what jobs we should
Mm,
keep for ourselves? I think we can decide that, and we can say, no way is a AI ever going to be allowed to replace a
mm,
teacher or a doctor or a nurse, because that's just so important. And we can decide, what we want and how we're going to use it. I
yeah.
don't think we should feel helpless. I think we should
Mm,
seize the bull by the horns, like they say.
yeah. And perhaps like in certain sectors we might not want AI to apply as much as in other sectors. So say for example, when it comes to healthcare as compared to law enforcement, like we might want to um, analyze our use of AI in both ways.
Yeah, I think we need to learn to. AI is it should be helping us, not us, living at the AI's beck and call, really.
I fully agree, and I think it's. I mean, it's very nice to hear you say that also, because I think hearing you speak, I realize I'm maybe a lot less optimistic than you seem to be about our ability to make collective decisions when it comes to tech. Because one of the things that keeps coming up in conversations that I'm a part of in my head is always that, you know, because we can doesn't mean we should. For example, you any kind of like new AI technology or any kind of thing that even uses an algorithm is now an AI company. You have conversations about using the blockchain literally everywhere, and it doesn't really, like, it's not always clear to me what kind of value addition using these kind of systems is making in any particular context. And so I think it's yeah, I think at least at this point we do have to in some way collectively think about how it is that we want our world to operate in the kind of context of tech. Maybe it is happening in some, and as more jobs, as more of our lives are being affected, maybe we'll have more of a kind of collective reckoning about it. And I really hope we do, and get to a better place than we're at right now.
Yeah, I think the words AI first have stopped having all meaning for me because everything seems to be AI first now. But also, another thing that I'm getting from this conversation is that as the use of AI becomes more ubiquitous throughout the society, it's something that we need to see how it plays out with more traditional protections and laws that exist. So,
Mm,
in this particular conversation, of course, to a large extent, we've been looking at how something as new as emerging tech laws around AI play out with something more traditional like labor law, because labor law is something that has a very rich history and jurisprudence, and you can trace how the workers rights evolution have come through, and then suddenly you have gig platforms and all of it is right back up in the air again. So there are some real questions here about how AI, for all the good it does, it also brings in such this massive amount of change. And then you kind of have to see where you want to go with it. But also, of course, the evolution of the space is so fast that it's hard to keep up with the changes. So I guess my last question to you is that how do you think gig platforms will evolve? So 10 years from now, What do you think a gig platform like Uber will look like?
We're asking you all the easy questions today. What should regulation look like? What should platforms look like? Just give us all the answers.
Um, I just wanted to end on a positive note and just say that it's really up to us what we want it to look like, and uh, yeah, we need to decide how we want to deal with this beast. But I can't tell you what's going to happen in 10 years.
I'll add a more scary note to what Nadia just said. I think that's a very good question. And I think here I would like to introduce the concept of sectoral, or some would say sphere transgression. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but it's actually a very simple concept. So the notion basically describes how powerful technology companies can use their infrastructures and their resources to enter into previously untouched sectors. So, for example, a company may be operating in the healthcare sector, but then it may later choose to expand its business into the finance sector, or even like the law enforcement sector. This can obviously have implications for the individual involved, particularly as it relates to how their data is going to travel and what it will mean for their privacy. So, I can give another example that is closer to home and most listeners can probably relate to. So you might recall that at one point, apps like Uber, they are just solely a ride-hailing app. But today we also have Uber Eats. So you can see that there is a crossing of boundaries between these two spheres, from Uber just providing simple transport services to now operating in food delivery services also. So in this case, we might not think too much about it, because like, what is actually so bad about a company having all this information about what we eat and then where we are going to go to later? But I would just say that all data is valuable data at the end of the day, and these data points can reveal a lot about you as a person. uh, in Singapore, I can say that there are platforms similar to Uber, I shall not name them, that have also crossed into many autonomous and untouched spheres. So I'm not just talking about food delivery here, but there are ride hailing companies that have entered into sectors like financing, banking, and even insurance, which is obviously very dangerous. Very problematic when we think about the kinds of profiles that these platforms will have about their workers or even their customers. How is this data going to be used, and where is it going to be sent across? So, to go back to your question, and with this concept in mind, I think this is the trajectory of gig platforms. Platforms will become a lot more powerful, they will have a lot more usable data, which can go into building invasive algorithms or even sold to third parties. So I will conclude on this point, that this is why AI governance and regulation is so important to think about, to balance out these power hierarchies.
Yeah, I think what you've just said mirrors a lot of what we're seeing in other sectors in tech as well. This is reminding me, for example, of a New York Times article, I think that came out a couple of years ago, where this one reporter was trying to go without, at this point, I don't remember if it was without big tech entirely or without using Google. And she found it almost impossible because, like, essentially, the
It's
fact is Google
impossible.
controls so much of the online ecosystem. And if you add, like, I guess, an Amazon to this right now, then it's going to be impossible to actually exist. And potentially even in real world kind of spaces, right? Because there is a lot of investment, like you're saying, in defense, in law enforcement, and a lot of these other sectors. I also think one thing that's going to be interesting is that we're seeing, because if we do talk about AI, this is not something we've really discussed, but just came up right now for me. If we talk about the use of AI in things like law enforcement, in judicial context, etc., then
Mm,
essentially a lot of that is going to have to be provided by private entities as well. And so I think a lot of what we might end up seeing is also, those with the kind of money to be able to provide and maintain these services ending up, becoming big players in the space. This is at this point, I mean, obviously
for,
pure conjecture, but it's interesting.
for sure. And I'll add to your point on how hard is it to live without big platforms. I did a personal experiment myself. I deleted like ride hailing apps, and I just can't. Like, if I want to get a taxi on the street, it's so hard. So yeah, it's really quite impossible.
A thought just occurred to me while I was listening to Jane speak, and this is completely the opposite of my cheery disposition beforehand. Um, the thought occurred to me, like, what if rogue government got hold of all that information? I mean, we've got several wars going on around the world right now. It's a huge amount of information, and you could so easily control people with that, and that's a pretty scary thought. I think.
Mm. And I guess like these public-private partnerships are not unheard of at all. I remember during COVID, the government was working with a lot of these private companies as well at some point, so they were sharing data.
Yeah, especially because like I think I forget again which country this was in. But there was an example of essentially someone who was providing national sort of defense services who ended up also providing contact tracing kind of services because using the tech that they had
Mm.
developed. So yeah, there was definitely an overlap, I think, between, and also in some
Mm.
cases it can be essential, right? Like it was important during COVID. It's just that once once you open that door in any kind of context to tech, it's just really hard to shut it once the emergency kind of situation is done, which is I think the problem that we're seeing now.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think this answer encapsulates most of the podcast quite well because we started by saying humanity can come together and sort of stand up to AI, and within a span of a few minutes, we have now ended with big tech will own whatever little of the world is left, and things will only get worse from here.
To
So,
be
on
fair, we're
that
not
cheerful note,
saying big tech will own it. We're just saying it's currently what is happening. But we can definitely, do things to change that, hopefully.
There's a way out.
right. Sorry, to clarify, big tech will not own the world. It will just own more than it currently does, which is already a lot of it. So I will end with Nadia's original point, which is that there have been shifts in labor markets before. People have come together to solve a lot of problems. There are regulatory approaches that you can use, and yeah, potentially everything will work out for the good.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, if we think about being up to us, it's more empowering for sure than thinking everything will end.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jane and Nadia, for joining us today for this conversation. We're so thankful you were able to take out time, especially given all of this time difference, to join us here and tell our listeners about this intersection between gig economy and AI that is becoming so important right now.
Thank you, Nidhi and
Thank
Ashraya.
you
That
so
was,
much for the opportunity.
yeah. Thank you.
We would love to hear your thoughts on the episode and your suggestions on what topics you would like us to cover. You can reach out to us through email or find us on our social media. We will link the details of these in the show notes. Lastly, we would like to thank National Law University Delhi for their support in creating the podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening to the podcast. We look forward to bringing you more content. This podcast is created by Center for Communication Governance at National Law University Delhi. This episode was edited by Gopika.